Welcome to Radio US. In early 2025, the United States witnessed an unprecedented public outcry in response to the mass layoffs ordered by the Trump administration. The layoffs, which affected thousands of workers in both public and private sectors, became a defining moment in the early years of President Donald Trump's second term in office. The decision, which the Trump administration justified as part of its effort to reduce government spending and eliminate inefficiencies, was met with fierce resistance from the American public. The resulting protests, which erupted across major cities, were not merely about job loss, but about a broader sense of injustice and the growing disconnect between the government and its citizens. The Trump administration, in an effort to streamline government operations, initiated a sweeping series of layoffs aimed at reducing the size of the federal workforce and cutting government spending. This decision was part of President Trump's ongoing commitment to cutting down on what he referred to as government inefficiencies. He argued that such cuts would not only reduce the national deficit, but also ensure that government operations were more effective and financially responsible. However, many Americans, especially those directly affected by the layoffs, saw these actions as part of a broader disregard for the welfare of the nation's workforce. The layoffs were not limited to one sector. In fact, the Trump administration targeted both federal government employees and workers in private industries that had been receiving government subsidies. The move was justified as an attempt to cut waste and improve efficiency, but for the people who lost their jobs, it felt like an attack on their livelihoods. The Trump administration's decision came at a time when many workers were still reeling from the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result, the layoffs were seen by many as not just an economic setback, but a betrayal by the government. Following the announcement of the layoffs, President Trump held a news conference to address the public and explain the reasoning behind the decision. The Trump news conference, which had been highly anticipated, quickly became a flashpoint for public anger. Instead of providing reassurance, Trump's remarks only seemed to deepen the divide between the administration and the American people. In his speech, Trump continued to emphasize his commitment to economic growth, focusing on the successes of his policies, such as tax cuts for businesses and deregulation. However, many people felt that these achievements were being highlighted at the expense of ordinary Americans who had just lost their jobs. The president justified the layoffs as necessary to improve government efficiency and reduce the national debt. He argued that the government needed to eliminate wasteful spending in order to make room for more productive investments. However, for many watching the Trump news conference, the president's remarks were tone-deaf and lacked empathy for those affected by the layoffs. Trump's focus on long-term economic goals, while important, seemed disconnected from the immediate needs of the workers who had just lost their jobs. His comments failed to address the immediate financial hardships that millions of Americans were facing. Instead of providing a clear path forward for the displaced workers, the Trump administration appeared to dismiss their concerns. No specific plans were announced to help these workers find new employment or to provide retraining programs. The Trump news conference left many citizens feeling unheard and ignored. The administration's refusal to acknowledge the real-world consequences of its actions only fueled the growing sense of frustration among the public. The response to the Trump administration's layoffs was swift and intense. Protests erupted across major cities in the United States, with demonstrators marching to demand that the administration reverse its decision. These protests were not just about job loss, but about the broader economic inequalities that the public felt were being exacerbated by the government's actions. Many of the protesters argued that the Trump administration had prioritized corporate interests and financial efficiency over the well-being of the nation's workforce. The mass layoffs were seen as a symbol of a larger trend in which the government was more concerned with cutting costs than with supporting the people who made the country function. The protests quickly gained momentum, with people from all walks of life joining in. Workers who had lost their jobs, union members, and concerned citizens came together to demand that the Trump administration take responsibility for the consequences of its policies. The message was clear. The American people were fed up with being ignored by those in power, and they were willing to take to the streets to ensure that their voices were heard. The protests were not limited to just large cities. Smaller towns and communities across the country also saw demonstrations, with people demanding that the government do more to support those who had been affected by the layoffs. Citizens expressed frustration over the fact that while large corporations had benefited from government tax cuts and bailouts, working-class Americans were being left behind. The lack of support from the Trump administration for displaced workers only deepened the sense of injustice felt by many. Despite the widespread protests, the Trump administration remained steadfast in its decision to lay off workers. In subsequent statements and press releases, President Trump continued to defend the layoffs as necessary for the long-term health of the economy. The administration maintained that reducing government waste and cutting inefficiencies were essential for ensuring that the country would remain competitive on the global stage. The president argued that the layoffs were part of a larger plan to overhaul the federal government and make it more efficient. However, many Americans were unconvinced by these justifications. The focus on cutting government waste, while an important goal, did not address the immediate needs of those who had lost their jobs. The Trump administration's refusal to engage in a meaningful dialogue with the public only intensified the frustration. For many, the layoffs symbolized the administration's failure to prioritize the welfare of the American people. With the midterm elections approaching, Democratic leaders seized on the issue of the layoffs to attack the Trump administration's economic policies. They argued that the layoffs were a clear example of the government's failure to address the needs of ordinary citizens. They also pointed to the broader economic inequality that had been exacerbated by the administration's policies, particularly tax cuts for corporations and deregulation, which had largely benefited the wealthy. Republican lawmakers, on the other hand, continued to support the Trump administration's decision, arguing that the layoffs were necessary for reducing government waste and creating a more efficient government. They maintained that these cuts were essential for ensuring the long-term health of the economy. However, this stance did little to quell the growing protests or persuade the public that the administration's actions were in their best interest. The protests highlighted the deepening divide between the government and the American people. For many Americans, the layoffs were not just an economic issue, but a symbol of a larger problem: the increasing concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few. The Trump administration's policies, while benefiting corporations and the wealthy, had left working-class Americans struggling to make ends meet. The lack of empathy shown by the Trump administration in the wake of the protests only deepened this divide. The Trump news conference, which had been intended to explain the administration's actions, instead reinforced the perception that the government was out of touch with the needs of its citizens. The refusal to engage with the public's concerns only intensified the sense of frustration and disillusionment felt by many. Whether the president could successfully navigate this crisis would have lasting implications for his second term in office and the future direction of American politics. Thank you for tuning in to Radio US. We appreciate your support. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more exciting updates and content. Stay connected and stay informed.